Today's story sounds exactly like an urban legend. It sounds too exaggerated, too grotesque, too terrifying to be real. But it is. This is the true story of the Bitvki Park Maniac. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to help build the Like Button's new dresser they just got from IKEA, and as soon as you open it up, immediately find all the screws, strip them all, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Moscow, Russia, which is one of the world's richest cities, is home to more billionaires than any other European city. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's richest neighborhood, the Golden Mile, you will reach one of Russia's poorest neighborhoods, the southern Moscow suburbs. Nicknamed Zhopamira, which means the asshole of the world, these suburbs used to be a thriving neighborhood with tens of thousands of working-class Russians and their families calling it their home. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the money and the jobs in this area dried up completely, and even though the residents wanted to relocate and live somewhere with more opportunity, they couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, and so they were trapped. And since 1991, really nothing has changed in these suburbs. Today, there are still tens of thousands of now very poor Russian families that still live there, living in these totally overcrowded Soviet apartment buildings that are these big, square, identical-looking things that are literally falling apart. And most of the people who live in these suburbs either are unemployed or they work some dead-end job that barely pays them any money. The police in the suburbs are completely underfunded and, for the most part, are corrupt. And so crime over the years has really taken a dramatic uptick. Also, drug and alcohol abuse are completely running rampant in this part of the world. But despite their notoriously rough living situation in the southern Moscow suburbs, these residents do have one claim to fame, and that is the Bitvki Park. Bitvki Park is comprised primarily of a massive, lush green forest that is full of wildlife and beautiful streams and clearings, and it sits right on the southern edge of the southern Moscow suburbs. In total, the park covers a whopping 2,700 acres and stretches 4 miles from top to bottom, which makes it 3 times bigger than New York City's famous Central Park. Bitvki Park had always been a popular tourist destination for people living around Moscow, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the park's popularity skyrocketed, specifically amongst people that lived in the southern Moscow suburbs. As their lives continued to become more bleak in the 1990s, they compensated by going to the park as much as they possibly could. They would take long walks in the woods, they would play chess with their friends along the peripheries on the park benches and tables, or they'd go cross-country skiing in the winter. Basically, year-round, this park became their escape from their miserable everyday lives. But that would not last. Starting in the early 2000s, something totally unexplainable and terrifying began happening in the park, specifically in the heavily forested area in the park. And eventually, this unusual event that was taking place got so completely out of hand that the residents of the southern Moscow suburbs stopped going in the park. They were literally too scared to go inside. The strange phenomenon began in 2001. From May to July that year, 10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of Bitvki Park. All of them were alone when they were last spotted, and all of them were men. Now, there was some precedent for people suddenly going missing in this part of Russia. Every now and again, people would try to flee these suburbs to try to make a better life for themselves somewhere else, but time and time again, they would just come back a couple of days or weeks later because it hadn't worked out. But when these 10 men did not come back in a couple of days or weeks, their families went to police and reported them missing. But unsurprisingly, the police did not launch an investigation. Instead, they accused the 10 missing men of just being drunk bums who probably wandered off somewhere, and whatever trouble they were in, it was their fault. Now, the families and the locals did not buy this explanation, but there really wasn't a better explanation. These men really had just kind of vanished. No one had any idea where they went. And so given the kind of general grim outlook on life that lots of people held in this area, people just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And they moved on. But in October of that year, so 2 months after the 10th man had gone missing in the park, another man went missing in the park. And then by the end of the year, 4 more men had vanished inside of the park. And all of them vanished under the same circumstances, last spotted alone in or around the heavily forested area in the park. The families of these 5 men would go to police, they would report their family members missing, but again, the police did not launch any investigation and blamed the missing people for being responsible for whatever happened to them. And then after that, the families kind of mourned the loss of these 5 men, not really sure what to make of it, and locals kind of gossiped about it for a little while and started to speculate about what might have happened to them and kind of lumped them in with the 10 other men that had gone missing. But after a while, when no new news came out about what happened to them, everyone just kind of moved on again. And unbelievably, this pattern would repeat itself for nearly 4 years. From 2002 to late 2005, 25 more people would go missing inside of Bitvki Park. 24 of them would be men, 1 of them would be a woman, although it wasn't clear if she was actually in the same category as the other 24 men, but regardless, that put the total number of mysterious disappearances inside of this forested area in the park up to 40. But still, the police shrugged it off, and eventually, so too did the local population. Everyone just kind of moved on, like this phenomenon wasn't happening, that people were not going missing in droves inside of this forest. But everything would change with missing person number 41. Because unlike the previous 40, this missing person would be found again. 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharchenko was a retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the southern Moscow suburbs with his family. He was a classic Russian tough guy who chain-smoked cigarettes and drank lots of vodka. And even though he was well aware of the missing person phenomenon inside of this park, that wasn't about to stop him from doing the thing he loved, which was going on walks inside of this park. He figured whatever was out there, he could handle it. So one evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister that he was going to go out for a walk in the park. But that night, he didn't come back, and so his family was very worried about him, but they decided they would wait until the next morning to see if maybe he showed up. But the following morning, when Nikolai did not show up, his family went to the police. But per usual, the police did nothing. A few days later, a local was walking fairly deep inside of the forest inside of Bitvki Park when they noticed well off the trail, off to the left side, there was something unusual kind of tucked in the underbrush. Now, this local was all alone. They had kind of a bad feeling about whatever this was, and so they called the police and they reported seeing something strange. And surprisingly, the police did actually come out and they went over to investigate, and they found this unusual thing was Nikolai Zakharchenko. He was lying face down, he was fully clothed, and he only had one injury, but it obviously had been fatal. He had a massive hole on the back of his head. This was not from a gunshot. This was from massive blunt force trauma. He had been struck so hard that literally the back half of his skull was blown clear off. The police searched the area in hopes they might find the murder weapon or some other clue as to what happened to him, but there was nothing. And so all the police could deduce was that Nikolai had obviously been attacked either by a person or group of people or even an animal, and that whoever his attacker was or whatever his attacker was had clearly snuck up on him, given the location of his injury. Now that the police had a body, and it likely looked like it was a murder, they could no longer ignore the fact that so many people had gone missing inside of this park, and it was looking like probably if they looked around the park, they might find more bodies. So the local police called in reinforcements from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department, and they came to the southern Moscow suburbs, and with the local police, they began searching every inch of this park looking for more bodies or just for any indication of who or what was behind this attack and behind all these missing people. But after several days of a very extensive search where they looked everywhere in this park, all over the forested area, they found nothing. At the same time this huge police search was going down inside of Bitvki Park, news about Nikolai's death had spread amongst the southern Moscow suburbs, and people were now getting really scared. Before, the fear of the park felt kind of theoretical because there were no bodies. And so even though it seemed far-fetched, it did seem possible that maybe all these people were getting lost on their own, that they really were just drunks stumbling off. But now, with the discovery that one of these missing people had been horrifically killed, that made the danger associated with this park feel very real. And so it was around this time that most residents of these suburbs stopped going inside of this park in fear of whatever was out there in the forest. And they would forbid their children from going in, and they would tell their neighbors, don't go in the park. And they gave this evil thing that lurked in the forest that caused men to disappear and attacked Nikolai, they gave this thing a name. They called it the Bitvki Park Maniac. But despite the fear of this maniac causing so many people to avoid this park, and despite the massive police presence that was in the park constantly looking for bodies, looking for clues, and just generally patrolling the area, despite all that, people still continued to go missing in this park. Starting just a week after the discovery of Nikolai's body in November of 2005, all the way up to April of 2006, 9 more men would mysteriously vanish in the forested section of Bitvki Park. And just like Nikolai, just a couple of days after they were reported missing by their families, they would be found lying out in the middle of the park with the backs of their heads caved in. But unlike Nikolai, most of these 9 victims had been found with a glass bottle jammed into the hole in the back of their head, meaning almost certainly this was the work of a human, not some animal. By this point, almost no one was stepping foot inside of the park, because it was basically common knowledge that, a serial killer is obviously on the loose in the forest. But despite this, there were still some very stubborn people who continued to go inside of the park. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Pichushkin. He had been born in the southern Moscow suburbs, and he still lived with his family in the same tiny apartment he had grown up in. It's safe to say Alexander's life had been more difficult than his peers. When he was just 4 years old, he fell backwards off of a swing, and when he sat up, he was okay, but the swing came swinging back and smashed him in the front of the head, causing brain damage. Now, his family did not have the money to send him to a hospital, and so when he stood up after getting struck and he was kind of able to walk around and he seemed okay, they determined he was fine and they didn't follow up. But Alexander was not fine. The injury had impaired his cognitive abilities, and years later, when he went to school, the other kids would bully him for sounding dumb. By the time Alexander was in high school, he felt like an outcast. He didn't have any friends, and he was miserable. But his grandfather, who lived in the same apartment complex as he did, he noticed this about Alexander, and he decided he would take him under his wing and he would look after him. And so the first thing he did is he asked Alexander to come over, and he taught him how to play chess, believing that would be something they could bond over. And when he taught Alexander the rules of this game, which are quite complicated, it was like it opened up the secret portion of Alexander's brain that had never been opened before. Alexander immediately absorbed all this information about chess and became a master of it practically overnight. Within a couple of days of being taught how to play, he was beating his grandfather virtually every time they played together. And so his grandfather was totally thrilled about this and was very proud of Alexander. And so he decided to bring Alexander down to Bitvki Park, where all these old men who were total chess masters were always playing chess on all of the park benches and tables. And so he brought Alexander down there and he put him up against all of these incredible players. And very quickly, Alexander was wiping the floor with them. and they loved him for it. He was their star. He was their prodigy. They totally adored him, and they respected him. And when they found out he was getting bullied at school, they made a point of telling him that he would always have a place with them in this park. And so for Alexander, this was like the best moment of his life. He finally felt like he was accepted, and he finally felt happy. And so over the years, even after Alexander's grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go down to Bitvki Park to play chess virtually every day. And he kept going to the park to play chess, even when men began going missing in the park, including some of the men he played chess with. And Alexander continued going to the park to play chess, even after bodies began piling up in the park. Alexander's mother was terrified for him and felt like he didn't understand the risk he was putting himself in by going to this park all the time. But every time she pleaded with him not to go, just take one day off from playing chess, Alexander would say, "Mom, I'm gonna be fine." And then he would leave anyways. In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and worked for a local grocery store stocking shelves. By this point, at least 50 people had vanished mysteriously in the forested section of the park, and 10 bodies had been found. On the morning of the 12th of that month, Alexander showed up to the grocery store for his shift, and right away he noticed there was a new employee. It was this beautiful older woman he had never seen before, and Alexander, while he was confident playing chess, was not remotely confident around women. He had never had a girlfriend before. But he found himself looking at this woman across the store, feeling like she was different, that she was more approachable than other women. And so he told himself that day he was going to go up to her and he was going to say hi. And so all through his shift, he kind of awkwardly watched this woman from a distance, kind of building up his confidence. And then at the end of his shift, her shift was also ending, the pair walked outside at the same time, and Alexander was about to say something, but he just couldn't find his voice. And then he noticed this woman had put a cigarette in her mouth, but she was fishing around for her lighter, like she couldn't find it. And so Alexander jumped into action and pulled his own lighter out, and he held it out to her and said, "Hey, can I light your cigarette?" And so before long, the two were chatting, and they were walking together and smoking their cigarettes. And over the course of their conversation, Alexander would learn this woman was named Larissa Kolegina, and she was 48 years old, and she lived near Alexander's apartment. And so after they walked for a little while, they arrived in front of her apartment building. And at this point, Alexander knows she's about to go inside. And so he suddenly feels bold and he asks Larissa, "Hey, do you want to continue walking around with me for a bit and maybe do a pass through the park?" Now, at this point, the Bitvki Park was totally not a place you would bring people to. This is a place that everyone in the area is basically terrified of. But for Alexander, Bitvki Park was like his happy place. And so naturally, if he's going to take a woman on a date, that's where he's going to bring her. And surprisingly, Larissa was very quick to say, "Oh, let's go to the park." And so the two, they lit up another cigarette and they walked across the road and they walked through the front gates of the park. Their first stop was the chess tables along the periphery of the park, right outside of the forest. And the tables were totally empty. But at this point, that wasn't surprising given the fact that even amongst diehard chess players, really Alexander was the only one still willing to go back in there every single day. And so after seeing where Alexander spent all of his time, it seemed like it was time to turn around and leave. But neither Alexander nor Larissa wanted their date to end, and so they decided to light up another cigarette and then follow a walking path that kind of looped into the forest and came back out again. And as they entered the woods and got deeper and deeper into the forest, the chess tables that were behind them faded from view, and the sky began to get darker and darker as it was getting late. But the pair just kept on walking, maintaining their cheerful conversation. But at some point, as they talked and walked, the path below their feet stopped looking like the path they had originally set out on. Now they're stepping over broken logs and they're ducking under low-hanging branches, and it's not really clear if they're on a marked trail anymore. But neither of them bring it up. They just maintain their kind of light conversation and continue walking as if nothing's going on. However, they both definitely began walking faster and faster to maybe speed up this loop. But at some point, when it was very obvious they were no longer on a path, They both came to a stop. As they had walked, Alexander had been in front, and so when they came to a stop, he turned around and he looked at Larissa, and right away he could tell there was just something wrong about her. There was a look on her face that just didn't look right. She looked exhausted or sad or something. And then as he's looking at her, she inexplicably kind of collapses into a tree right next to her, and she grabs the tree with her arms and she slides down to its base, and she presses her cheek and her chest up against its bark, and she begins to cry. Alexander has no idea what's going on, so he just stands there staring at her. And in between sobs, Larissa looks up at Alexander and says, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander couldn't believe it. She was the first person to figure it out so quickly. Normally, he would have to tell his victims before he killed them. And so he smirked and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I am." And so Larissa, at this point, she lets out this huge sob and she looks down and she keeps crying. And then she looks back up again at him and she says, "Are you going to kill me?" And without any hesitation, Alexander looks at her and he says, "Yes, I am." And then he reached into his jacket and he pulled out a hammer. No one knows for sure why Alexander became a serial killer or why he almost exclusively targeted men. Many people believe it might have something to do with the brain damage he suffered as a 4-year-old when that swing hit him in the head, that somehow that rewired his brain and made him more aggressive towards other people, especially men. But that's just speculation. And other than that injury, there really isn't much in Alexander's life that stands out as a big red flag. He just kind of floated about his life and followed the crowd. But in 1992, when he was 18 years old, he got this urge to kill, and he actually decided to act on it. He brought up this desire to a classmate of his named Mikhail Odachuk, and surprisingly, Mikhail says to Alexander, "I want to kill someone too. Let's do it together." And so the two met up a couple of days later and they headed off to Bitvki Park and began walking around the forest looking for a lone person that could be their victim. And as they're walking along, Alexander, he's fully committed, but he can tell Mikhail is not. He's starting to get cold feet and he's talking about, maybe let's stop for now and head back and maybe do this another time. And Alexander, he's getting more and more angry and frustrated with Mikhail until finally Alexander decides, my first victim will be Mikhail. And so he turns to Mikhail and he says, "You know what? If you want to head back, you can." And Mikhail says, "Okay, maybe we can do this another time, right?" And Alexander says, "Sure." And so Mikhail turns around, and as soon as his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer and he smashes Mikhail in the back of the skull, causing Mikhail to crumple to the ground, either dead or unconscious. But either way, he's laying on the ground. And as soon as he is, Alexander remembers that they had passed a little while earlier this well kind of hidden in the middle of the forest. And so he grabbed Mikhail's body and he dragged him through the forest over to this well. And when he got to the well, he pulled the lid off of it, and then he picked Mikhail's body up, pushed him up and over the edge, and dropped him inside. And Mikhail fell 30 feet all the way down to the icy water below. And then Alexander put the lid back on the well, he grabbed his hammer off the ground, and he left. An important part of Alexander's killing was this well. This well was not a drinking water well. It was basically an access point to this deep underground sewer system that stretched all around the underside of this park. And so when Mikhail fell down this 30-foot shaft, he didn't just land at a pit of water right at the bottom of the well. Instead, he fell all the way down the shaft until it opened up like the bottom of a huge scientific beaker. It was basically like this big cave at the bottom of the well that was full of very deep water. And so Mikhail would have splashed into that water, which was icy cold, and then after Alexander put the lid on top of the well, it would have been pitch black inside of that space. Now, even if it had been lit up, there was no ladder for Mikhail to climb back out of. And there was a current running through this well because there were tunnels leading into it and then out the other side. And so Mikhail, if he woke up, if he was conscious when he hit the water, he would have immediately been swept into another tunnel. And many of the other tunnels that led away from this cave space were completely filled with water. And so he would have had nowhere to breathe. He would have been sucked into a tunnel and he would have drowned. And so whether Mikhail died from the strike on the back of the head or whether he drowned, we don't know. But he died after being thrown in the well, and then his body was swept miles and miles away to some deep underwater recess where nobody was looking. Alexander would wait another 9 years before he killed again. But once he started up again, he didn't stop. His first kill after the hiatus was in the summer of 2001. His victim was a man he liked to play chess with. In fact, this was a man that loved Alexander and was definitely one of Alexander's friends. They regularly played chess with each other. And one day in May, after a game of chess, Alexander asked the man if he wanted to head into the forest to pay respects to his dog, who he had buried out in this forest. And he told the man he was going to have a sip of vodka over his dog's grave. And so this chess friend of his agrees to go with Alexander because he loves Alexander. He's a good friend of his, and says, absolutely, let's go pay our respects to your dog. And so the pair begin walking into the forest, and at first they're on a trail, but eventually Alexander says to this man that you need to leave the trail in order to get to the gravesite. So the man says, yeah, no problem. And so they get off the trail and they're walking for a little while until they reach the well. And when they get to the well, Alexander stops and he kind of points to some arbitrary spot on the ground and says, oh, that's where my dog was buried. And so Alexander pulls out a bottle of vodka and he takes a swig, and then he hands it to the man, who does the same thing to kind of do this commemorative drink for this dog. And then afterwards, Alexander looks at his friend and kind of gestures with his arm to get the man to, take them back out of the forest, back out to the chess tables. And so the man turns around and begins backtracking. And as soon as he does, and his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer, he walks up behind his friend, and he smashes him over the back of the head. And then, just like Mikhail, he drags this man's body over to the edge of the well. He pulls the lid of the well off, and then he lifts this man up, and he dumps him into the well shaft, and then he puts the lid back on top. Alexander continued to lure his victims out to that well, and all of his victims were people he knew. They were his chess friends. They were his neighbors in his apartment complex. They were anyone he had a personal relationship with. He would later say that that was his preferred victim. He liked to know the person he was killing. It made him feel like God. Amazingly, it would turn out not all of Alexander's victims who were chucked into that well actually died. Victims number 16 and 17, who were a pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy respectively, after they had their heads smashed with the hammer and they got chucked into the well, their clothing got caught on a snag poking out of the inside of that 30-foot shaft, and it literally arrested their fall and kept them from plummeting all the way into the water. And somehow, in both instances, Alexander didn't notice. He just put the well lid back on and walked away, believing they were both dead. But they weren't, and after they regained consciousness, they were able to kind of claw their way back up the well shaft and pulled themselves out of the well. Both victims would go to the police, and both of them would positively identify who their attacker was, Alexander. But the police didn't care. In fact, they told both of these victims that they needed to drop the charges and leave them alone. And if they didn't, they, the police, would come up with something to have both of them arrested, the victims. And so Alexander got away with it, and the victims were literally intimidated by the police to stay quiet. And so that led to dozens and dozens more murders. In April of 2006, after Alexander told Larissa he was the maniac and he was going to kill her, he walked behind her as she cried and continued to hold on to the tree, and he wound up his hammer and brought it smashing into the back of her head. And then as she slumped to the ground, he hit her several more times in the back of the head with the hammer, and then he pulled out a vodka bottle and he jammed it inside of the hole, and then he left. 2 months later, Alexander would lure another woman out into the middle of the forest with him. Her name was Marina. She was 35 years old, and she had met Alexander while working at the grocery store with him. She actually was hired to work at the grocery store to fill Larissa's now vacant spot. Before Alexander and Marina began their walk out to the park, which was Alexander's suggestion, Marina said she just needed to stop by her apartment to let her son know where she was going. And so they swung by her apartment. Marina went upstairs and she left a note for her teenage son saying where she was going and who she would be with, and she even left behind Alexander's name and his phone number on this note. And so when she came back out again and she and Alexander began walking towards the park, Alexander knew that if he killed her, which was his intention, that he would certainly be caught. The police were on super high alert at this point, and they would certainly get their hands on this note, and that would absolutely implicate him, and so he didn't really know what to do. But by the time they were strolling into the forest, Alexander had decided he was going to kill her anyways. And many people believe he did this specifically to get caught, not to protect the public from himself, but because he wanted fame. He wanted recognition for what he had done. This theory stems from the fact that starting with his 41st victim, Nikolai Zakharchenko, Alexander began leaving his victims' bodies out in the open. He stopped putting them into that well. And he wouldn't just leave them out in the open. He would prop them up in strange poses against trees, and he would jam glass bottles into the holes in the backs of their heads, indicating he wanted the police to find them. That way, he could get all the credit he believed he deserved. When the police did finally arrest Alexander, they searched his apartment and they found this notebook. And in this notebook was a picture of a chessboard. Now, a chessboard has 64 squares on it, and in Alexander's notebook, this chessboard had 62 of the 64 squares filled in. And Alexander would explain to police that that was his scorecard. He had 62 victims. It would turn out 2 of those people had actually survived, the pregnant woman and the 13-year-old boy, but still, there were 60 murders accounted for in this notebook. Alexander would be fully cooperative with police and would tell them every detail he could possibly remember about every single killing, including what conversations were like with the person he killed right before he killed them. He would also often reenact what he did to the person and how he felt afterwards. It was very clear that Alexander was reveling in the attention he was getting from law enforcement, and it was very clear that he loved talking about killing. Ultimately, the police were only able to gather enough evidence to charge Alexander with 49 murders, not 60. And when Alexander heard this, he was totally disappointed, and he asked the judge if he could get credit for the other 11 murders to maintain his 60-victim mark. The judge said no. During his trial, Alexander was deemed to be such a threat, he was kept inside of a glass cage the entire time. And during the proceedings, he showed no remorse and in fact seemed kind of happy, like he was enjoying the spectacle of his trial. He was ultimately given the harshest penalty under Russian law at the time, which was life in prison without parole, and the first 15 years of his life sentence would be in complete and total solitary confinement. So virtually no human interaction, kept inside of his cell 24 hours a day with nothing in his cell all day long. Alexander is still alive today, and he is still in solitary confinement. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to help build the Like Button's new dresser they got from IKEA. And as soon as you open it up, take all the screws out, strip them all, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast where we upload brand new, never before heard content on Monday mornings. We also upload remastered YouTube content on Thursdays. The podcast is just called MrBallen Podcast, and it can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, Amazon, basically anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is just @MrBallen, and I do respond to the majority of my DMs. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes, and MrBallen en Español, which is a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen that puts out near daily content, and we also have a Snapchat channel, also just called MrBallen, that posts on Sundays. We also have some very cool merch. If you want to check that out, go over to shopmrballen.com. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In 2017, a group of 7 friends were wandering through this forest in New Zealand trying to get to this secret swimming spot. And as they're walking along this dirt trail far away from the road and there's no one near them, they suddenly hear this high-pitched, shrill siren sound coming from somewhere off in the forest. And so the group stops, they're listening to the siren, and eventually, after about 30 seconds, the siren stops. And at that point, these 7 friends begin exchanging very curious looks about what they just heard, but ultimately, they shrug it off and just keep on walking. Little did they know, that siren was trying to tell them to turn around and go the other way. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please send the like button a beautifully wrapped gift for their birthday, but fill the gift with a spring-loaded boxing glove that punches them right in the face when they open it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of Monday, February 6th, 2017, a group of 7 friends who were all college-aged and living in New Zealand began packing up their cars and getting ready to drive back to Auckland, the biggest city in New Zealand. The night before, the group had been out on Lake Tikitapu for a big concert called Flocella, where audience members would listen to the music while floating around on big blow-up rafts and floats. After the concert had ended, the group of friends had left the lake and headed to a nearby relative's house where they had a quiet after-party with a couple of drinks, and then everyone went to bed a little bit after midnight. This morning, the group had gotten up early because they wanted to get on the road as soon as possible to try to beat the holiday traffic that was sure to crop up that day on the way back to Auckland. February 6th is a big national holiday in New Zealand. It's called Waitangi Day, and it's to commemorate the initial signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is considered to be the founding document of the country. But right as the 7 friends had finished packing up their 3 cars and were getting ready to begin their 3-hour drive north to Auckland, one of the friends, a 21-year-old named Rachel De Jong, suggested they take a quick detour before they head back home. Rachel, along with another girl in this group of friends named Maddie, had several months earlier discovered this secret swimming spot that was located only about 15 minutes away from where they were now, and it happened to be on the way back to Auckland. This swimming spot was this beautiful green-blue pool of fairly deep water that was located in the middle of a forest. This pool was actually a part of the Waikato River. However, this stretch of the river where the pool was either very shallow or dry most of the time. So as a result, this pool actually looked like a standalone body of water. While there was no official trail that led through the forest to this pool of water, there was an unofficial trail. It was basically a dirt trail that cut through the woods that had formed over the years of locals tromping their way to this pool of water. After hearing Rachel's suggestion, the group of friends all agreed that this sounded like a great idea. And so the group piled into their 3 cars, and then by around 11:40 a.m., Rachel and Maddie had directed the convoy all the way to the start of this unofficial dirt trail, which was located right on the side of a winding main road. After pulling their cars safely off to the side of the road, the group got out, and then Rachel and Maddie led them to the start of this trail, and they began walking through the forest. 15 minutes later, at 11:55 a.m., the group was getting very close to the water because the trees up ahead were starting to thin out. But also at 11:55 a.m., the group suddenly stopped because from somewhere out in the forest, way off in front of them, came this loud, shrill siren sound. And it went on for nearly 20 or 30 seconds, and then it just came to a stop. And the group kind of looked around at each other. No one knew what to make of the siren, and so eventually they just kind of shrugged it off and kept on walking. Within a minute of that siren sound coming to an end, the group had made it to the end of this unofficial dirt track, which placed them at the edge of this beautiful overlook down to the pool they were going to swim in. And so they began one by one climbing down the rocks in front of them, where there were some ropes that had been put up to help people climb down to the water. And so after they got down to the water, all of them stripped down to their bathing suits, they jumped into the pool, and they began swimming out towards the center of the pool, where there were these two big rocks that jutted up out of the water, almost like miniature islands. And so Rachel and the other women, so 5 of them, they climbed onto one of the rocks, and the 2 men who were part of this group climbed onto the other rock. And so they got up onto these rocks and they're looking around, taking in the sights, and then at 11:58 a.m., another siren blasts across the forest. It's the same sound as the one they heard 3 minutes earlier when they were on the dirt track. And so once again, all 7 of them are kind of looking at each other wondering, what is this siren about? But after the 20 or 30 second long siren came to an end, they glanced around them and there was no sign of any danger. There was no sign of really anything happening at all. It was just this beautiful, peaceful seeming oasis. And so before long, they had forgotten about the siren again, and Rachel had gotten out her camera and she was taking pictures, and others were taking pictures as well. And then 2 minutes later at 12 p.m., the siren sounded for a 3rd time. Now, at this point, the group has heard the siren 2 other times. And even though the sound of the siren was kind of jarring because it was so high-pitched and shrill and really cut into their ears, this time, because they've heard it 2 other times and nothing happened, they all pretty much immediately wrote it off. So the siren's sounding for the 3rd time, and the group is not really paying attention. But when the siren finally stops this 3rd time, something very different began to happen, and the group immediately noticed it. Now, I know everyone has a lot to do to prepare for International Pet and Electric Eel Day. From the eel cigarettes to lure the slippery, cuddly little creatures out of the murky deep, to the mega-sized pack of ace bandages you'll need for post-shock wound care, there's a lot you need to enjoy this holiday. But what always happens when you fire up your wood-fired laptop and begin looking for these items? You get hit with a pua! Bah! 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 But don't worry, you can get back to doing what you love, petting electrically charged animals in the name of tradition, if you just use NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN ensure that all of your data stays safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature called Threat Protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting puas that keep disrupting your ability to purchase all of your various eel petting supplies. So, you can either sit on the sidelines this year while your family frolics about in the murky pools and calm stretches of the middle and lower Amazon and Orinoco river basins in South America petting truckloads of electric eels, or you can get NordVPN, and before long, you'll be up to your nostrils in cuddly electric eels looking for a good pet. Currently, the best deal for NordVPN is through my YouTube offer. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description. Okay, back to the story. When the 3rd siren came to a stop, the friends started to hear a new sound, and it was coming from the same direction the siren had been coming from, which in effect was upstream. Even though this river was basically dry, they could turn and look uphill, and they could clearly see where the river would go if it was full. And so the friends turn and look upstream, and they're listening to this really loud kind of smashing sound that's coming from that direction, and they're exchanging curious looks at each other, trying to figure out what that sound could be. And then all of a sudden, they see it. A white wall of water comes crashing around the corner and began barreling straight down the riverbed towards them. By the time the friends had even processed what they were seeing, the water had reached the pool they were in, and it was flooding the pool so quickly, they could literally see this huge pool rising. Its water levels were going up and up and up all around them. And so as the rocks they're standing on began to slowly submerge under all this rising water, the group collectively decided that this can't go on for very long. Whatever Whatever this is, it's gonna stop, so just stay put, stay on these rocks, we're gonna be okay. However, within seconds, the rocks they were on were completely submerged, and the water was still tumbling down the hill towards their pool, and then spilling out over the other side down the other end of the riverbed. And they're thinking to themselves, if we don't get off these rocks soon, we're gonna get swept downstream with this water. And so the two men who were on their own rock, they leapt to a rocky outcropping that was slightly higher up and was connected back up to the forest. And so this rocky outcropping represented safety. And so once they were up there, they turned around and they yelled to the 5 women still stranded on their rock to try to swim over to them, and the guys would grab them and pull them to safety. But by this point, the girls are looking around, the water's up to their knees, and it's rushing past them. They can barely keep their balance. They know if they attempt to swim in this water, they're gonna immediately be taken downstream with it. And so the group very quickly decides their only choice is for the women to literally jump and grab the men who have their arms outstretched for them. And so Rachel DeJong, she was the first one to try this. She leaps off the rock, she grabs the guy's arms, and she gets pulled to safety. And then she turns around, and she and the other 2 men continue to get the women to jump off the rock to them. And at first, it's going fairly well until they get down to the second to last woman who leaps, she grabs one of the guy's arms, and then both of them lose their footing, and the guy and the woman, they both get swept away downstream, they're gone. Rachel stays calm, and she moves to the position where the guy had been who just got swept away, and she takes out her GoPro camera selfie stick, and she extends it out to the last woman who's out on the rock. Her name is Alice. And she tells Alice, jump and grab the selfie stick. And so Alice, who's almost completely submerged in water now, makes this frantic jump to grab onto the selfie stick. She grabs it for a second, but then loses her grip, and she begins being swept away. And Rachel, who at this point was completely safe, immediately jumped into the rapids after Alice. She grabbed Alice, she attempted to turn around and grab the rock to stop them, but she couldn't get a grip. And she and Alice were also swept downstream out of view. 2 weeks before Rachel, Maddie, Alice, and the others had gone to this secret swimming spot, a warning sign, like a physical warning sign that warned people not to go near this river, don't go near this pool, was stolen. And that warning sign was normally placed at the very beginning of that unofficial dirt track that the 7 friends took to get to the pool. Meaning, when the 7 friends got out of their cars and began hiking into the forest to go to this pool, they would not have understood the danger of where they were going. Now, it is true that Rachel and Maddie had previously discovered this swim spot several months earlier. However, it seems like they had just learned that this swim spot existed and how to get to it. It did not seem like they had literally walked this trail and gotten to the pool, and so very likely they would not have known about the dangers this place posed. The pool of water they were swimming in was not actually dangerous itself. It was only dangerous because the pool was located in the middle of a spill zone. About 650 feet upstream of the pool they were swimming in is a dam, and 3 to 4 times a day, they open their gates, releasing 20,000 gallons of water per second down this mostly dry riverbed, and the water comes careening across that pool all the way to the bottom. The gates stay open for about 15 minutes, and the only reason this is done is for the spectacle of it. It's to show tourists what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built. And what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built was a raging rapid. On February 6th, 2017, the dam was set to spill at 12 p.m. So those sirens the friends heard at 11:55, 11:58, and then 12 were all warnings that a spill was about to occur. But of course, the 7 friends had no idea. After the 12 p.m. spill had finally ended, the 3 friends who had made it to the rocky outcropping and had not been swept away by the current went looking for the 4 other friends who had been swept away, and they would find them. 3 had miraculously survived, but 1 had not. The sole fatality was 21-year-old Rachel DeJong, whose idea it was to come and swim at this spot in the first place. Rachel also was the woman who had left safety and jumped back into the rapids to attempt to save her friend Alice. Today, there are many more warning signs and fences that have been put up around the Waikato River to prevent people from getting too close, because the dam still, despite the fatality, spills several times a day. However, despite all these precautions and all the notoriety around Rachel's death, people still today sneak in and go swimming in that secret pool. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please send the like button a beautifully wrapped gift for their birthday, but fill the gift with a spring-loaded boxing glove that punches them in the face as soon as they open it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings and remastered versions of our best YouTube videos on Thursday mornings. This podcast is going to be exclusive to Amazon Music starting November 1st of this year. But as of right now, it is still available on all podcast platforms everywhere. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to rewrite the ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Español. We also put out near daily content on Facebook, Snapchat, and TikTok. Those are all just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Are you tired of having all that disgusting extra money in your wallet? Does wearing flannel at every occasion, regardless of temperature or general appropriateness, sound exciting to you? If you answered yes to both of those questions, then you've come to the right place, because just last week, we opened up our brand new MrBallen Flannel Emporium, aka shopmrballen.com. From timeless classics like flannel tuxedos and flannel eyelash extensions to more modern takes like flannel bell-bottoms and flannel wigs, shopmrballen.com has all your flannel fashion choices covered. But don't you dare come into our emporium unless you've already slapped the like button and the 5-star review button right in the front left tooth. Failure to do so will result in you instantly being shipped off to Bell's Canyon. So, come on down to the brand new shopmrballen.com Flannel Emporium and throw away all that disgusting extra money in your wallet. But hurry up, because the shop closes in less than 2 weeks. Again, go to shopmrballen.com for all your flannel needs. shopmrballen.com. No matter how absurd this story gets, remember, it's true. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and lightly toast all of their bread and then put it back in the bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Winter of 1748, Timothy Dexter was born in a town just north of Boston, Massachusetts called Malden. Despite being incredibly dim-witted, Timothy always believed he was going to strike it rich one day. But looking around at his family, who were a bunch of poor farm laborers, Timothy realized he would need to make some big moves if he wanted that dream to become a reality. When he was just 8 years old, he decided he would make the first of his many big moves. And this move was to drop out of 2nd grade and go to work on a farm and then on to a leather tannery. For years, he worked hard, earning more money than his family had ever made, but he knew this line of work was not going to make him rich. And so, when he was 19 years old, he decided it was time to make yet another big move. He sold his best suit and used the money to relocate farther north to another Massachusetts town called Newburyport. He believed with their booming economy, he was bound to make some additional money there. And he was right, but his payday would not come from a higher paying job. When he arrived there, he met a lonely, wealthy widow named Elizabeth Frothingham, and he promptly married her, becoming rich overnight. After moving into her mansion and dubbing himself Lord Timothy Dexter, he suddenly felt lost. He had spent his entire life pursuing wealth, and now that he suddenly had it, he didn't know what to do with it. And so he looked around Newburyport at the other rich people and saw what they were doing, and he found that many of them held political positions. And so Timothy decided he would run for office too. But unfortunately, the voters caught on to the fact that he was a second-grade dropout who couldn't read or write or think critically, so he didn't win the election. But instead of accepting his defeat, Timothy began petitioning the town to let him have his political office anyways. And the town said, no, that's not how democracy works. But Timothy didn't really understand, and he just continued to send these carefully outlined petitions explaining exactly why they needed to appoint him. The town had to bring in experts that were able to decipher what he wrote, because Timothy was deeply illiterate, and his petitions were so riddled with spelling mistakes and were so confusing that at first glance it looked like it was written in a foreign language. After they deciphered them, they would immediately deny them, but Timothy just continued to send them. And so finally the town got so fed up with all of his petitions that they decided they would just give him a fake political title just to get him to stop and to low-key humiliate him. They offered him the title of the Informer of Deer, and they told him his job was to look high and low all over Newburyport for any signs of deer activity. And the joke was, in Newburyport, there are no deer. But Timothy did not find this humiliating. He did not see the joke in it. He took it very seriously and believed his petitions had worked. And so he took his political title and with great enthusiasm, he got to work, spending all hours running all around the town, carefully documenting all deer activity, of which there was none. At the end of his term, Timothy felt like he had accomplished a lot as the Informer of Deer and was ready to move on from political office. And so he turned in his official Informer of Deer logbook to the town and told them they should pass it along to the next Informer of Deer to get them up to speed. Unfortunately, when the town opened that logbook, they found it contained only crude pictures of deer and then illiterate ramblings about deer that were so difficult to decipher that even the experts weren't able to do it. And so the logbook was thrown away, and the Informer of Deer position was never filled again. Shortly after the American Revolutionary War broke out between the colonies in America and Great Britain, America began printing their own money to pay for their troops. But this money, called the Continental Dollar, it wasn't backed by silver or gold. It was just backed on the promise of future value if America won the war. That, combined with overprinting this money, led to rampant inflation, and very quickly the Continental Dollar was worthless. Some of the wealthy folk in Newburyport decided they would do the troops a favor, who were now destitute because they held all of this worthless currency. And these wealthy people offered to buy all of their Continental currency for a fraction of the price, which was better than nothing. When Timothy saw all these rich people doing that, he quickly jumped on the trend. But he didn't view this as doing a favor for these troops that needed the money. He viewed this as a great investment opportunity. He believed America was going to win this war and that eventually this currency was going to have lots of value. And so he invested all of his savings into buying back the Continental Dollar. When word spread that Timothy had made this terrible investment, because at the time, nobody was predicting this currency would have any worth, really even if America won the war. When they found out that Timothy had made this ridiculous investment, his peers, the other wealthy folk in Newburyport, they were thrilled. They were so annoyed by Timothy, and they didn't like the fact that he was kind of on their level because he had some money. And so they were excited to see him go bankrupt. But sure enough, at the end of the American Revolution, when America won the war, Congress made good and backed the currency, making Timothy one of the richest people in America overnight. Right away, Timothy used his second big windfall of cash to purchase the most luxurious mansion in the richest neighborhood in all of Newburyport. But beyond that purchase, he didn't really know what to do with all of this money. It was very overwhelming. And so after several weeks of deep introspection where he tried to figure out, who he was now and what he wanted to be, it suddenly became clear to him. He needed to construct 40 wooden statues of random famous men on his front lawn. These statues included George Washington, Napoleon Bonaparte, Thomas Jefferson, and of course himself. The inscription under his statue read, "The first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world." After a sculptor was done, Timothy went out to inspect all 40 statues, and he discovered what he believed to be a huge discrepancy on one of them. Underneath Thomas Jefferson's replica, it said the author of the Declaration of Independence, which is accurate. But he told his sculptor that he was supposed to put down the author of the Constitution. And the sculptor very gently said, "That's not right. It should be the Declaration of Independence." Timothy became irate. He was not having it. And so he ran into his mansion and came out with his oversized hunting rifle and began firing at the sculptor's feet until he made the change. After Jefferson's title was fixed, Timothy noticed another discrepancy on another statue. He walked over to the George Washington replica and looked underneath it at the inscription, which said George Washington. And Timothy just shook his head, got out a paintbrush, covered it up, and wrote one word: Pitt. Just Pitt. Because periodically Timothy would confuse George Washington's name with Pitt, and nobody could convince him otherwise. By now, the other wealthy folk in Newburyport had really grown to resent Timothy, and now he was just showing off his wealth with his totally ridiculous mansion and all of his statues, and so some of these aristocrats wanted to find a way to just ruin Timothy. And so, knowing he was not a very bright man, they decided they would start giving him deliberately terrible investment tips. The first being that he should buy a whole bunch of warming pans and send them to the Caribbean. A warming pan is like this big frying pan that you load up with hot coals and you slide under your bed to stay warm at night. This works really well in a cold environment like Newburyport, but is completely worthless in a warm tropical environment like the Caribbean. But Timothy believed he was being given some great insider trading information and absolutely took this to the bank. And he went and bought 2 ships and he loaded them up with 40,000 of these huge warming pans and he fired them off to the Caribbean. And when they got there, the locals didn't know what they were or what they were for, but they found these warming pans served as great ladles for molasses, and they all sold out for a huge profit. And so Timothy went to those aristocrats and he thanked them for their incredible investment tip. These rich people were furious that their plan had backfired, and so they decided they would pitch him another, even worse investment tip that was bound to ruin him. They told him, "Why don't you buy up a whole bunch of coal and send it to Newcastle, England?" Newcastle being the coal capital of the world, where there was so much coal there was actually an expression at the time, "That's like sending coal to Newcastle," which meant you're doing something completely pointless. But these fine rich folks had never done Timothy wrong, and so he took their advice and once again took it to the bank. He loaded up his ships with coal and he sent them off to Newcastle. And this would have ruined him had it not been for the coal workers' strike that occurred right before his shipment arrived. And so when Timothy's coal arrived on the shores of Newcastle, there was a coal shortage and all of his coal sold out for another huge profit. And so once again, Timothy went back to the aristocrats and said, "Thank you for the incredible advice." Now truly irate that their plan has backfired 2 times, these aristocrats got together and said, "Okay, we got to set him up for something that's going to make him fail." And so they pitched him one more terrible investment tip. This was, "Hey Timothy, why don't you go buy all the whalebone you possibly can? Just hoard it, keep it in your house, because someday it's going to get really valuable." At the time, whalebone was extremely expensive and losing its value every single day. But again, Timothy thinks, these people have never done me wrong, I'm going to do just that. And so he went out and he collected thousands of pounds of these rotting whale bones and made a huge stockpile in his basement. And shortly after he had built up this mountain of bone, over in France, it became fashionable for men to wear corsets. And wouldn't you know it, these corsets were made out of whalebone. And so once again, Timothy's investment completely paid off. And so he tipped his hat for a 3rd time to these rich folks that just keep making him more and more money. After these 3 big investment wins, Timothy was very confident and he viewed himself as a shrewd investor. And so he began to believe that he could identify winning investments himself. And so the first winning investment that he identified was to purchase all these stray cats in Newburyport that were lined up for euthanization. Timothy figured these mangy, sick, feral animals would make great house pets in the Caribbean. And so he loaded them all onto his 2 ships, he fired them across the sea, and wouldn't you know it, they sold like hotcakes. Not because they were cute and cuddly, but because unbeknownst to Timothy, the Caribbean had a huge rat infestation problem in their warehouses, and so his shipment of stray cats arrived at the perfect time. At some point, after all these successful investments, Timothy started to wonder about his legacy. How would people remember him after he was gone? And so there was only one way to find out. Timothy, very elaborately, faked his own death. And as he hid, watching his funeral, he noticed his wife, Elizabeth, wasn't as sad as he thought she should be over the death of her husband. And so he leapt out in front of the thousands of people that were there, and he began beating his wife with his cane. After this, Timothy decided he didn't really like his wife anymore, and so he decided he would just tell people she was dead, even though she was not dead. And so when people came to Timothy's mansion and they saw his wife walking around, clearly alive, Timothy would tell them, "Oh, she's a ghost." And because at this point Timothy was so wealthy and so influential, people just kind of accepted this and began viewing Elizabeth as a ghost. Before Timothy's actual death, he penned an autobiography called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, a title that to this day people still don't really understand. Inside the book were 24 pages of completely illiterate ramblings with absolutely zero punctuation. The book was so terrible that it actually sold out very quickly because people thought it was funny to buy this book. After people criticized Timothy for not using any punctuation, Timothy printed a second edition where at the very end he included a single page with 13 lines of just random punctuation marks with a note at the bottom that said, "Go ahead and sprinkle these in as you see fit." In 1806, just a few years after publishing his book, Lord Timothy Dexter, the informer of deer, quietly passed away. This time for real. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and lightly toast all of their bread and then put it back in the bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Twitter or on Instagram. My username on both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. And so after several weeks of deep introspection about who he was and what he was going to be, it became clear to him. He needed... I can't even say it. He needed to build 40 wooden statues of random famous men. Timothy figured these mangy, sick, feral animals... These mangy, sick, feral animals would make great outfits. In 2005, in a little town in Illinois, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, walked into this strange living room inside of an apartment where on the ground was this circle of lit candles. And the trio, without saying anything, just marched into the circle of candles and took seats cross-legged on the ground, all looking inward toward each other. Then, after sitting there for a second, it was like suddenly the air in the room seemed to change, and when that happened, the woman began to speak. Except it wasn't her voice. It was like this dark, guttural voice that almost sounded like a man speaking, but it was clearly coming out of her mouth. But the 2 men who were sitting in the circle watching this woman, they were expecting this, and so they sat there listening intently for their instructions. And then after they got their instructions, the 2 men waited for the woman to stop talking, and when she did, she handed them a special tool for the ritual, and then the 2 men stood up, they said their goodbyes, they turned around, marched outside, hopped in the car, and began driving towards their target. But before we get into that very bizarre story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, when the like button has just finished raking up all of their fallen leaves in their yard, break out your leaf blower and obliterate all of their piles. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kottner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner. And Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room. And also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby, because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant. And so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast. And the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so, of course, that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Irenia to other witches in this coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex. And so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them. And as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones. And so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this voice, "I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex." And then after saying this, Irenia, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, "Blessed be." And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place. And he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irenia had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. The other day, old Seagull Lung was looking pretty down, and so naturally, I offered him some of my iced wildebeest retinas to suck on, but he just shook his head and said, "Dad, thank you, but what I really need right now is, a bloodthirsty horde of zombies to descend on this town so I can savagely destroy them with various DIY weaponry." But alas, zombies aren't real, and so my dream will never come true. And at this point, I just slapped Lung right across the face, and I said, "Lung, are you kidding me? You ever heard of a little thing called DLS? Doomsday Last Survivor? You kidding me? They literally have trillions of zombies you can slaughter right now. You kidding me? Come here, let me explain to you what this is. In Doomsday, you enter a dark, post-apocalyptic world filled with your beloved bloodthirsty zombies, and it's up to you to strategize and survive their wrath. You can customize shelters, and you can even recruit heroes with their own special abilities that will help you slaughter all these zombies. And right now, you have a chance at some of the $5,000 cash that's up for grabs for playing this game. You can be a lone survivor, or you can join forces with other players and alliances to try to withstand the zombie invasion. Heck, heck, if you get lucky, you might even be able to join me and old Sing-Along's alliance. And for a limited time only, you can earn a special rare name tag that shows off your part of the Ballin' Squad when you download the game using my link. And remember, there's $5,000 cash up for grabs right now. To potentially win some of that money, click the link in the description below, download the game, and then in the page, you'll see there's something called a might ranking, and the top 3 people in that ranking walk away with up to $1,000 each. Outside of that ranking, many other players will be chosen for cash prizes, some up to $100 each. Hurry and download Doomsday right now so you can join the limited time events and earn the legendary hero Jaden. The next zombie wave arrives in 8 hours, so come and join me and old Sing-Along now! A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger, lived, a 20-year-old army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother. And Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him, and then when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. But unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, you know what, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over and he'd given her a hug, and his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend, because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Josh's life and kind of, get back together again. And so, of course, Josh had said yes. And so here he was at this house in Claremont. Now, Josh had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger. But Josh didn't really mind that there was extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation. But it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen and the two of them chatted for hours. And then finally, at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed. So he said goodnight to his mom, he retreated to the bedroom, and he laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone, and, he felt ready for that, but at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive, it's about to happen, I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually, Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy. And so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, you know what, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work. The dog just kept on barking. And then when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up, wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. And so acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed, he ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mom is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground, and then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Rick, he began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world, he was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one. And so Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. We have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irenia, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irenia didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then, before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irenia, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irenia's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Irenia and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay, the evil witch's house, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005. At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's street and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves. And then after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Irenia from the spirit world. Now, Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Josh's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window. And Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house, he just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realized it was too late. They were totally caught. And so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David and he sees David grab something from his belt and he pulls it out. And it was the tool that Irenia had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out this sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual, and it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger, to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay, but perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irenia about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously. Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irenia to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex, to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen. And Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was why Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch, she managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbor's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother as well is struggling on the ground. And David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around. And Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with this shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was throbbing and bleeding, because he had stabbed himself. And then after Rick had stabbed himself, Jackie just walked over and Spartan kicked Rick down the stairs into the basement. And then Jackie turned his attention from Rick to David, who was still just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David, and David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbor could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, had scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbor who didn't even do anything, outside, and Rick just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so at this point, the neighbor didn't even try to figure out what happened. He just called 911. But it was already too late for Josh, the army private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq. And here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irenia had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irenia, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irenia, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex. That had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irenia had previously dated Jackie and they had broken up, and Irenia still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irenia just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irenia had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead, it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the army private, who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach. And then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irenia would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years. And a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up, they were sentenced to 32 years in prison. One of the most haunted places in the entire United Kingdom is this little nondescript farmhouse in rural Wales. In 1989, Bill and Liz Rich, who were newlyweds, moved into their dream home, this little farmhouse in Wales. And pretty much right away, terrifying things began happening to them. They began hearing these loud footsteps marching around their second floor, but as soon as they went up there, there'd be nothing. And then Bill and Liz began randomly waking up in the middle of the night, and at the foot of their bed would be this dark figure just staring at them. Bill and Liz were terrified, but their fear was ratcheted up tenfold when their neighbors began telling them about their home's very dark and insidious history. And not long after that, Bill began to change. To hear the full terrifying story, listen to the special 2-part bonus Halloween episode on the Bedtime Stories podcast. This episode is called The Curse of Heol Vanog. And be sure to follow and listen to the Bedtime Stories podcast wherever you get your podcasts to hear more bone-chilling stories. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that has literally hundreds of stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. If you have heard of Piggy Palace, the focus of today's story, then you know how horrific this story is. If you've never heard of Piggy Palace, well, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please set the like button up for a practice sales call with William M. Buttlicker. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Robert Picton was born in 1949 in Port Coquitlam in British Columbia, which is about 15 miles to the east of Vancouver. He, along with his brother and sister, were raised by their parents on a big pig farm. In the 1970s, their parents passed away, and so the property was handed down to them. Robert and his brother took over the daily operations of the farm, and their sister decided to just move away. Over the next couple of decades, Robert and his brother attempted to run the pig farm, but pretty quickly they stopped taking care of it, and it fell into decline. Neighbors and visitors recalled seeing the pigs that were still there free roaming the property. And as for the brothers, it appeared they had just stopped bathing, and despite walking all day in mud and pig feces, it seemed like they never took off their boots when they went inside. One of the few farm workers that stayed with the Pictons through the farm's decline was a guy by the name of Bill Hiscox, and he said the farm was a really creepy place. And he also said Robert was a really creepy guy that was prone to just totally bizarre behavior, even though he didn't smoke or drink or use any substances. Eventually, the Picton brothers realized they were not cut out to run the pig farm like their family had for generations before them, and they decided their best move was just to sell portions of their land. But neither of them could have guessed just how much their land was worth. From 1994 to 1995, they managed to sell off almost all of their property to an urban developer for over $5 million. And so suddenly, these filthy, failed pig farmers had become millionaires, and neither of them knew what to do with the money. After a year of just sitting on the money and not doing much with it, they decided they wanted to do some good with their money. And so they established an official charity in 1996 called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. Their charity's purpose, at least on paper, was to help raise money for various organizations that they deemed worthy by running events like dances and shows. And while that might have been their original intention for this charity, what it ultimately became was a guise to host these wild drug and alcohol-fueled parties inside of their slaughterhouse, which, even though it wasn't being used anymore because they were no longer really doing any pig farming, it still conspicuously had big hooks coming down from the ceiling and bloodstains all over the ground underneath them. These Piggy Palace parties became infamous in Coquitlam, drawing crowds of up to 2,000 people, predominantly bikers, drug addicts, and prostitutes from the poverty-stricken downtown east side of Vancouver. Robert had become familiar with that part of Vancouver because he used to go through there all the time to dispose of animal waste products at their rendering plant. Once the Piggy Palace charity was in full swing, Robert started going back into that neighborhood where he would cruise down the 10-block strip called the Load Track and would attempt to recruit people to come to his parties. Most of the people he recruited were down on their luck women who only agreed to go because he was offering them food and money and drugs and alcohol. At the same time Robert was running this recruiting campaign, women from the downtown east side began disappearing in droves. These disappearances were noticed by the men and women in the downtown east side, but they didn't report them because they had a general distrust of the police and of authority figures in general. But as more and more and more women disappeared from the downtown east side, rumors of a serial killer operating in that area started to circulate. Residents began only going outside if they could walk around in a big group group of people, and everybody was just totally on edge, keeping careful lookout for anything odd about the neighborhood, people that shouldn't be there, cars that shouldn't be there. But despite this heightened security, women continued to go missing at a rapid rate, and nobody knew why. When the police were finally contacted about all these missing women, their response was lacking, to say the least. Since there were no bodies of these missing women, the police said it was reasonable to assume that the women were to blame, that their lifestyles must have caught up with them and they either ran off somewhere or perhaps they overdosed somewhere and their bodies just haven't been found yet. Despite residents of the downtown east side saying, no, this is different, there's something wrong here, the police basically said, we're not getting involved. When the newspapers found out about this totally apathetic response from the police, they criticized them for intentionally deprioritizing these missing women because the majority of them were drug addicts and prostitutes, and so therefore weren't worthy of a full investigation. The police rejected this claim. On the evening of March 22nd, 1997, so 1 year after the Piggy Palace had been stood up and they started throwing all these parties, and 1 year after dozens of women have gone missing from the downtown east side, the Pictons' neighbor heard a frantic knock on their front door. They ran over, they opened it up, and what they saw was this woman who was hunched over with one hand on her bleeding stomach, and dangling from her wrist was a handcuff. The neighbor was obviously shocked at what they were seeing, but they quickly ushered the woman in and they called her an ambulance. The woman was rushed to the hospital where she immediately was put into emergency surgery. Afterwards, while she was in recovery, she told her nurses that her name was Wendy and she had been at one of those Piggy Palace parties, and one of the owners of the farm, Robert Picton, had tried to put a handcuff on her, and when he did, she fought back. He drew a knife, he stabbed her in the stomach, she was able to get the knife back, she stabbed him in the face before turning and running out the door and making it to the neighbor's house. Right after she told this story, Robert Picton actually showed up at the exact same hospital with a serious laceration on his face that was consistent with being stabbed. The medical staff had already called the police, who showed up minutes later, and when they went inside, they searched Robert and they found in one of his pockets a handcuff key. And that handcuff key opened the handcuff that was still on Wendy's wrist. And so when the police saw that, they arrested Robert on attempted murder. While Robert was in custody, he explained to officers that Wendy was lying. She was a drug addict and she had come to one of their Piggy Palace parties and he had caught her trying to rob them. He had confronted her, she drew a knife, and that's when a struggle ensued and both of them got stabbed. And Robert said he was just lucky to be alive. The police believed him and dropped all of his charges and let him go. When Robert got back to the farm, Bill Hiscox, the one worker who still worked for the Pictons, he grew very suspicious of Robert. He had read all about the missing women from the downtown east side, and he knew Robert regularly went over there to pick up women and brought them back to his parties. And Bill just always had that gut feeling that something was off about Robert. And so he sat on this gut feeling for a couple of months until finally he decided he had to tell someone. And so he called the Crime Stoppers tip line and he told them that he thought Robert had actually attacked Wendy, not the other way around, and that actually Robert was most likely behind some or all of these missing women from the downtown east side. Bill also said that a recent female party guest at the farm had seen a pile of women's clothing inside of Robert's trailer, along with at least 10 purses and women's ID cards. The police followed up with Lisa to confirm what she saw, but she was scared of Robert and said she wasn't going to cooperate. And so the police, without this testimony, were unable to secure a search warrant to investigate this further, and so they kind of just forgot about it and moved on to other cases. Over the next few years, the Pictons continued to throw these huge Piggy Palace parties until the city finally shut them down, and dozens more women disappeared from the downtown east side without a significant police investigation, despite the fact that Bill was calling them all the time to say he believed Robert Picton was behind all of these disappearances, but they weren't taking him seriously. Finally, in 2002, a former employee of the Picton farm came forward to police and said that he personally had seen illegal weapons inside of Robert's trailer. And this was enough information for the police to get a search warrant and raid the pig farm. And in February of that year, they did just that. And they found inside of Robert's trailer the illegal guns, as well as several items directly connected to some of the missing women from the downtown east side. Robert was arrested, but let out on bail. He was put under surveillance and told he he could not go back to the farm until they were done conducting a more thorough search. And during that more thorough search, they found blood from one of the missing women inside of Robert's trailer. And so Robert was rearrested and charged with murder. While he was being held in jail, he shared his cell with another man who he believed was just another detainee. But he wasn't a detainee, he was actually an undercover police officer, and their entire interaction was being recorded. And on this recording, Robert makes a few shocking statements.
You got me. What do you got? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. You got, I know what's up. You got a missing person. We better look at how you made it. I find the best way to dispose of something. Take in the ocean. Stay good at that. No. That's good. Pretty good. Okay? Mm-hmm. Can't do much left. That's what I was talking about. Build a series with antifreeze, and you inject yourself, and you're dead in better than 10 minutes. That was just one more that we can even bigger than ladies, bigger than months in the States. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is already about 40. Jesus.
As Robert admits in this video, he killed 49 people, who would turn out to be the majority of the missing women from the downtown east side. After a lengthy investigation, it was determined Robert's killing spree began in 1991, but it really kicked up a notch in 1996 when he and his brother started Piggy Palace, because he was able to use their huge parties to lure more victims to his farm faster. And once they were at his farm, he would lure them into his trailer, where he would handcuff them, tell them it's over now, and he would inject antifreeze into them, or he would strangle them to death. Afterwards, he would move the victim's body to the slaughterhouse, where he would butcher them like a pig. A large portion of his victim's remains would be fed to his pigs, and the parts he didn't feed to his pigs, he would bring to the rendering plant in the downtown east side, which is not far from where the victim was most likely picked up. A rendering plant takes animal waste products, crushes them up, and turns them into a gelatin. This gelatin is used in many everyday products, from candy to cosmetics, which means Robert's victims wound up in things like lipstick and gummy bears. Also, sometimes while Robert was going through this horrific disposal process, he would set aside some of the best cuts of meat and grind them up with pork and turn them into sausage. This sausage was served at Piggy Palace parties. It was also given to neighbors and food banks and orphanages. After sifting through 300,000 cubic meters of soil and pig feces underneath the Picton farm, investigators were only ever able to find little bits of remains of 26 women. Robert was charged with all 26 murders, but only 6 turned into convictions due to a lack of evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison and is still alive today. His brother and sister were never charged in connection with the crimes. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please set the like button up for a practice sales call with William M. Buttlicker. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts, where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.